Hello and welcome to part 7 of my history of jazz. On part 6 last time I was looking at the 60s free jazz, so we've got to the 70s, which obviously we're going to be discussing jazz fusion. Now this channel, of course, is all about jazz fusion, so I'm going to skirt round actually discussing jazz fusion because I'd like to talk about something else that I feel is really important to tackle at this point in this series. When I set out to do this series, I really wanted to give an alternative view and bust some of the myths around jazz history. The first myth I wanted to bust was that, the original jazz, Dixieland jazz, all that type of music was some sort of innate, natural form, historic form, and try and bring up alive the fact that this is a new form of music which really embodies ideas of freedom and democracy and what it is to take your place in a sort of democratic society, which I think goes along with this idea that the Afro-Americans, that was the thing they were trying to achieve in America, which makes the form very, very inclusive. Anyone can play jazz, which meant that the form went out into the world and assimilated everything around it. So you get French jazz musicians and Chinese jazz musicians, and it goes into every style of music, and it became the dominant artistic form of the 20th century. Now, why do I want to make that point? I think because that goes a little bit against certain ideas in jazz history, which we're going to get to in a bit in this episode and the following episode. The other thing that came across as I was doing these videos, which I hadn't thought about, was the importance of commerciality. That a lot of the jazz forms that existed and survived because they made money. And by the 1930s, the swing era was an incredible era for jazz because it combined real popular music, dance music, vocal popular song with high compositional value, high instrumental virtuosity. And in the 1940s, we saw that fracture. And the commercial side of jazz goes into popular song, and eventually also it goes into rock and roll and creates, popular music. But also you get the other side going into bebop. And although bebop's an incredibly creative and influential form, it jigs the idea of what jazz is into being an esoteric art form, with perhaps some snobby values attached to that, as opposed to a popular art form. When we get into the 50s, we see the bebop ideas actually being softened and more commercialised by people like Dave Brubeck and Miles Davis. But we also see the rise of a sort of the civil rights movement, which is really linked into free jazz as musicians, as freedom becomes such a much more important subject matter, the want to free jazz becomes so much more important. And so we arrive at where we're at now, in the 70s, or we arrive at what I'm discussing now. So this episode is going to be called The New Swing. No, sorry, it's going to be called The Second Swing Era. I think that the 70s can be compared to the 1930s. Because in the 70s, jazz did the same thing. It just started to assimilate all these ideas from outside. It took a lot from free jazz, right? It took the free jazz ideas and it actually mixed the free jazz ideas with pop and rock music ideas. And you get jazz, rock and fusion born, and which was a really commercial form. Such a commercial form that the record companies loved it, so they pushed it, which created for a short while in the mid-70s, a really fertile landscape for musicians to do some incredible stuff with decent budgets, and decent distribution, which is incredible. But I must mention that isn't the view taken by many jazz historians. I've mentioned the Ken Burns jazz documentary, and it's a brilliant documentary in if you want to study jazz history, especially early jazz history. But when I watched it, when it got to the 70s, the storyline was that sort of jazz got assimilated by popular music forms and wasn't jazz anymore. And the way they cover the 70s is by discussing Dexter Gordon. Now, Dexter Gordon was a cool jazz post-bebop saxophone player from the 1950s who had dropped into obscurity. He'd actually moved to Europe and was doing gigs out there. And in the 70s, he returned to New York, I think, and he did a gig. And the idea in the Ken Burns film is that Dexter Gordon somehow kept jazz alive. Pure, real jazz was kept alive by Dexter Gordon, preserved from the pollutions of jazz fusion and commerciality. Now, I'm really going to get into this idea in part 8, where I look at the 80s, when Wynton Marsalis emerges as one of the big dominant voices in jazz. And I think that's the roots of this sort of reimagining of what jazz is. The sort of snobby, elitist, perfect form of high art, which should never be tainted by commerciality. That idea of jazz, which I think is there right now, to this day. But the 70s wasn't like that. When the fusion thing happened, suddenly, again, for the first time in like 30 or 40 years, jazz was selling some records. Now, I have here what I think is the top 35 biggest selling jazz albums of all time. Now, I'm going to accompany this video with another video where I'm going to go through and sort of rank each of those albums for their artistic worth, to see whether the biggest selling albums are the most commercial, or whether there is some artistic merit to those big selling albums. But when you go through the top 35 jazz albums of all time, 15 of them are fusion albums. That's nearly half, right? So we have a form of music, a form of jazz, which is getting ignored by the mainstream to some extent, isn't it? When half of the biggest selling albums of all time are fusion albums, you would have thought that fusion would have more gravitas in terms of the history of jazz. All right, and I see this manifesting itself in so many different places. One of the things I see is fusion musicians never get counted in the history in terms of the iconography of jazz. All right, in my country here in the UK, we celebrate many British jazz musicians. There's been some incredible musicians like Joe Harriott, Stan Tracy, Tubby Hayes, and then more recently Courtney Pine, and really incredible musicians. And I'm going to talk about these as we go. But for me, the most important British jazz musician is John McLaughlin. And John McLaughlin's important because he's a pioneer of guitar. He changed the shape of guitar playing, but more importantly, he is the dominant, creator of jazz fusion, in my opinion. He's not the first guy, he's not the guy who invented it, but in terms of codifying it and selling records, it's John McLaughlin. He really puts fusion on the map, not only with the Mavish Orchestra, not only with his guitar trio with Aldemir Pakadalithia, which also sold millions of records, but also with Miles Davis on those seminal albums like Bitches Brew in a Silent Way, Jack Johnson. And yet, never in the UK, here in the UK, if you were to ask the British jazz scene who's the most important British jazz musician, you'll never get John McLaughlin mentioned, right? In some way, what happens is the fusion musicians get displaced from the story of jazz. And that really happens in the Ken Burns documentaries. Musicians like Keith Jarrett, John McLaughlin, Chick Corea are barely mentioned, or in some cases not mentioned at all. And these are some of the biggest selling artists in jazz. Now, do you want to know who the biggest selling artist in jazz is? Right? There's a jazz musician that has sold 65 million albums. And what's interesting is on this list here, right, he's not included. Right? And that's Kenny G. Kenny G has sold 65 million albums, which puts him in superstar category. That's as big as some of the biggest rock bands and pop acts of all time. Now, I'm sure me mentioning Kenny G, that snobby jazz elite thing is going to emerge now. I'm sure some of you watching this right now are going, oh my God, Kenny G is terrible, it's all soft, it's fused out, whatever. Right? But Kenny G is a jazz musician and he makes jazz and jazz fusion. Right? What do you expect to be the biggest selling jazz artist of all time? Albert Ayler? Archie Shepp? What do you expect? Right? The point is, for me, is he is a jazz musician. Right? It may be really soft and easy listening, right? And the thing is, it's not easy to make easy listening music. It's not unskilled, right? Kenny G has skill. He doesn't have skill at playing like Michael Brecker, but he has skill in taking the jazz form and packaging it up in a way which the mainstream normal people are going to like, right? Does it have the artistic worth of a Miles Davis or Sonny Rollins? Well, no, I don't think it does. But he is a jazz musician, so why omit him? Why delete him? Right? Why not count him in this history? Why is it the commercial end of jazz is treated like this by most jazz musicians? You know, where's the sniffiness? Now, the thing is, when you get to the next video and I actually go through these fusion albums here, when you look at the ones that have really sold a lot, some of those are difficult, challenging albums. What an achievement for jazz to have made albums that have sold in the millions that are actually so difficult to listen to, that have been able to take the listener and grab them and educate them in that way. That's a really powerful thing that jazz has done. You know, and this is one of the things that the critics do. When I was young, I can remember about 1982 when Wynton Marsalis did emerge, and I didn't want to talk about him in this video, but I got to mention it. There'll be a lot more about him in the next video when I look at the 80s. But one of the things he said, he went, yeah, fusion's all right, you know, it's nice if you just want to have a party and lay back, but it's very shallow music. And proper jazz, real jazz, you know, that Art Blakey made and, you know, Charlie Parker, that's proper music, which is, you know, it's heavier and it's like more intellectual, you know. And that was the thing he said, right? When we look at the albums in this top 35 albums, there's albums like Bitches Brew. Now, I would argue that Bitches Brew is far more difficult, far more innovative, far more creative than anything Wynton Marsalis has ever made in his life, right? When I first heard Bitches Brew, it was a challenge to me. A lot of these fusion albums were like a challenge to me when I first heard them, because they were difficult. And the reason is because the way these fusion guys were soloing was not coming necessarily out of swing era jazz or even bebop. Because of the time that jazz fusion emerged, the form before it was free jazz. And free jazz, I think, you know, however difficult it is as a music to listen to, and it is, still has the spirit. This is what's coming out to me. I've learnt this myself, you know, doing these videos. It still has the fundamental spirit of what makes jazz great, and its inclusiveness. Bebop was not an inclusive form. You had to be a virtuoso musician just to play that music. And I think there's people out there that think that that's what makes jazz great. I don't think it is. I think what makes jazz great is it's a communal form in music where everyone can be involved and everybody in that ensemble can express themselves within a set of rules. Free jazz changed those rules, but it was still trying to be inclusive. In fact, it was so inclusive that musicians who couldn't play through the changes could get involved in improvisation. You know, there was another way of playing. And the free jazzers, what they did was show there was numerous ways of doing that. You know, you could do it modally, you could do it in that Coltrane harmonic way, you could do it in just the Ornette Coleman way, or you could just express your inner rage in that Albert Ayler way of playing. A lot of the people that created jazz fusion, the Larry Coryells and the John McLaughlins and the Gary Burtons and the Miles Davis, could play bebop till the cows came home. They knew that stuff absolutely inside out, right? But the thing was, they were open enough to take those free jazz styles in, right? So the bebop thing's in there, and I think it's in the phrasing, right? So in here, on this list, there's a number of fusion albums. One of them is Heavy Weather by Weather Report. Now, I had a student once who went for an audition at a jazz college, and he went in, he was a bass player, and he played Teen Town. And the guy turned around and the guy sort of said, I don't want to hear any of that riff shit. Right? Now, that is the attitude that I've had around me all my life when it comes to jazz. Right? Now, the first thing is, there is no riffs in Teen Town. Teen Town is actually like a bebop melody transferred to bass. So this is one of the things Jaco Pastorius did. He actually did it on the track Donnelly, right? But also on Teen Town. The phrasing and the note choice and the note selection and the way the melody line runs, the melody is transferred to bass. It's like a bebop bass line, and it's put against a disco beat. Now, this is what the jazz snobs are hearing. They're just hearing the disco beat, right? Why? Because bebop didn't swing. Bebop swung, right? You could stick a disco beat across bebop anytime. You think that's a mistake? Do you think that's something that's a byproduct of bebop? No, it's what bebop was about. So if Charlie Parker was here now and I was talking to him, and there he is all depressed because he hardly sold any records, he never got on a major label, and he died at 34 years old, right? I would say to him, Mr. Parker, you changed the face of jazz. And he goes, what do you mean I've changed the face of jazz? I said, the way you played, the way you phrased, changed music forever. It changed jazz, but in turn, it influenced popular music. And I would go, look at this album by Weather Report. This sold 1 million copies, right? It got to the top of the charts. People danced to this, and they danced to your phrasing. There it is on the album. Wow, what an achievement, you know. So what I did wasn't in vain. No, of course it wasn't. You know, this is something that I think needs to be stated, right? That being successful, that selling records, you know, that making music that people like is not something to be sniffed at, right? And if you can do that and make high art, which I believe undoubtedly all these jazz fusion musicians did, that's quite an achievement. So, the 70s, the era of jazz fusion. If you actually want to know about jazz fusion, go and look at all my other videos, because there's loads and loads of videos on jazz fusion. In fact, there's a video called The Oranges of Jazz Fusion. Start there and have a go through that. And then I've tried to cover all the major jazz fusion artists. It's all there for you. So I haven't really talked about that. But what I really wanted to get into on this video was the perception of jazz fusion, right? And the way it's been sidelined. But the 70s in jazz history should be celebrated. It should be celebrated for being the second high point in jazz history after the swing era. It's where jazz got its teeth back into culture again, right? I actually think if those jazz fusion artists hadn't have sold in the 70s, there would have been no Wynton Marsalis, because there would have been no jazz departments in the major record labels anymore, right? There would be no system out there to push jazz out, right? And in a way, Wynton Marsalis is as much of a fusion as the 70s guys, but we'll get into that in the next video, shall we? So the next video we'll be looking at the 80s, and I'm going to be contrasting two artists that dominated that decade. One will be Pat Metheny and one will be Wynton Marsalis, and we'll be seeing which one wins. I think you can guess whose side I'm going to be on, but it's going to get more contentious in the next video, everybody, so I hope you're looking forward to that. But anyway, thank you for watching. I hope this was interesting for you, and if you like, if you want to subscribe. But most importantly, put your comments in there, because you know I love the comments, and I will answer them all if I can, and I will read them all, and it keeps the conversation going. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video, which is going to be looking at the biggest selling albums in jazz history, and then I'll be following that up with a look at the 80s. Thank you very much.